In the dark forests of East Prussia, on August 29, 1914, a Russian general walked alone through the trees. Exhausted, overweight and suffering from asthma, Alexander Samsonov struggled to keep pace with his retreating staff. Behind him lay the shattered remnants of 150,000 men, an entire army, destroyed in just 5 days. Ahead of him only shame and an impossible choice. Around midnight, he slipped away from his officers. Minutes later, a single gunshot echoed through the woods. This is the story of how one of World War I's greatest military disasters unfolded, and how a personal rivalry spanning nearly a decade helped seal the fate of thousands. Title card: The Tragedy of Tannenberg. To understand what happened in the forests of East Prussia in August 1914, we must travel back 9 years earlier to another battlefield on the other side of the world. The year is 1905. The Russo-Japanese War has been raging for over a year, and Russia is losing. At the Battle of Mukden, one of the largest land battles ever fought before World War I, over 340,000 Russian troops faced 280,000 Japanese soldiers across a front stretching 90 miles through Manchuria. Leading the Russian cavalry on the left flank is General Paul von Rennenkampf, a Baltic German nobleman with over 2 decades of military experience. In another sector of the battlefield, cavalry commander Alexander Samsonov leads his men with what witnesses describe as energetic leadership. But the battle becomes a disaster. The Russian forces, poorly coordinated and outmaneuvered, are forced into a chaotic retreat. Samsonov, furious and looking for someone to blame, publicly accuses Rennenkampf of failing to provide crucial assistance during the fighting. The accusations are devastating. In the rigid hierarchy of imperial Russian military culture, such public criticism is tantamount to calling a fellow officer a coward. Whether the charges have merit becomes almost irrelevant. The damage is done. According to some accounts, the confrontation escalates dramatically. Stories emerge of a violent encounter at a railway platform in Mukden. Some versions claim Samsonov slapped Rennenkampf across the face. Others describe him striking the general with a whip as Rennenkampf climbed into his railway carriage. Still, other accounts suggest the two men exchanged blows directly. The truth of what exactly happened on that platform remains murky. Some historians question whether any physical altercation occurred at all. But one fact is undeniable. From that moment forward, the two generals despise each other with an intensity that will have catastrophic consequences. After the humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, both generals attempt to rebuild their careers. Rennenkampf finds redemption in brutality. During the 1905 revolution that convulses Russia after the war, he leads forces that ruthlessly suppress rebellions in Siberia. His efficient violence earns him the grudging respect of the Tsar's government, though revolutionaries mark him for death, surviving multiple assassination attempts. By 1912, he commands the Vilno military district, a prestigious posting that puts him in line for senior command. Samsonov takes a different path. In 1906, he becomes Chief of Staff of the Warsaw Military District. 3 years later, he's appointed to an even more prominent position, Commander of the Turkestan Military District and Governor of Russian Turkestan, the vast Central Asian territories of the Russian Empire. It's a role that combines military command with political administration, far from the front lines, overseeing a region known for its challenges of distance and diversity. For nearly 9 years, the two men avoid each other, their careers developing on separate tracks across the vast expanse of the Russian Empire. Samsonov, in particular, has been away from major military operations for years. His experience limited to garrison duties and administrative responsibilities in the remote regions of Turkestan. Then in June 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. Within weeks, the intricate web of European alliances begins to unravel. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia mobilizes to support its Slavic ally. Germany, bound by treaty to Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, prepares for German invasion. By early August, the Great War has begun. Germany has prepared for this moment with the Schlieffen Plan, a bold strategy to knock France out of the war quickly before Russia can fully mobilize its massive army. German military planners have calculated that Russia's enormous size means mobilization will take weeks, perhaps months. The plan depends on this assumption, but they have miscalculated. Responding to desperate pleas from France, which faces a massive German invasion through Belgium, Russia launches an offensive far earlier than anyone expected. On August 15, 1914, barely 2 weeks after the war begins, Russian forces cross into German East Prussia from 2 directions. The Northwestern Front Command assigns 2 armies to the invasion. From the northeast, General Paul von Rennenkampf will lead the First Army, 210,000 men, toward the fortress city of Königsberg. From the south, General Alexander Samsonov will command the Second Army, approximately 206,000 men, swinging northwest around the Masurian Lakes to cut off German retreat. If the plan works, the German Eighth Army, roughly 150,000 men, will be caught between 2 massive Russian forces and destroyed. It's an ambitious plan. It's also the first time since the Battle of Mukden that Samsonov and Rennenkampf will operate as part of the same campaign, their success dependent on coordination and mutual support. 9 years after their bitter feud began, the 2 generals who despise each other are being asked to work together to achieve one of the most important objectives of the entire war. Coordinating them is General Yakov Zielinski, commander of the Northwestern Front. But Zielinski is hundreds of miles away from the battlefield, and communication technology in 1914 is primitive at best. The stage is set for disaster. On August 20, 1914, Rennenkampf's First Army clashes with German forces at the town of Gumbinnen in northeastern East Prussia. The battle is chaotic and bloody, but when it ends, the Russians hold the field. The German Eighth Army commander, General Maximilian von Prittwitz, panics. Facing what he believes are 2 massive Russian armies closing in from different directions, he orders a full retreat to the Vistula River, deep inside German territory. It's a catastrophic overreaction. When news of Prittwitz's order reaches German Supreme Command, the response is immediate and brutal. The Chief of Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, relieves Prittwitz of command on the spot. To replace him, Moltke makes 2 critical appointments. He brings Paul von Hindenburg out of retirement to command the Eighth Army and assigns Erich Ludendorff, fresh from victory at the Siege of Liège, as his Chief of Staff. But neither Hindenburg nor Ludendorff created the plan that will define the battle. That credit belongs to a brilliant and impish staff officer named Colonel Max Hoffmann. Hoffmann possesses knowledge that will prove more valuable than divisions of soldiers. He knows the Russian commanders personally. During the Russo-Japanese War, Hoffmann served as an observer with the Japanese forces, a common practice that allowed military powers to study each other's tactics. In Manchuria, he witnessed not only the battles, but the dysfunction within Russian command. Most importantly, he observed the bitter feud between Samsonov and Rennenkampf firsthand. Now, in August 1914, this knowledge becomes weaponized intelligence. Hoffmann makes a calculated prediction. Rennenkampf will not rush to help Samsonov unless absolutely forced to do so. The personal hatred between the 2 generals can be exploited. If the German Eighth Army can position itself properly, it might be possible to concentrate overwhelming force against Samsonov's Second Army, while Rennenkampf remains too far away to intervene. It's an audacious plan built on the assumption that personal animosity will override military necessity. But Hoffmann is betting his career, and possibly Germany's eastern frontier, on his reading of human nature. Then the Germans receive an intelligence windfall so extraordinary that experienced officers initially refuse to believe it. Russian field commanders are transmitting their orders by radio in plain text, completely unencrypted. The reasons for this catastrophic security failure are mundane but devastating. The Russian army's rapid mobilization has outpaced its logistics. Code books haven't reached all units. Communication officers, lacking encryption capabilities and facing urgent tactical situations, make the fatal decision to broadcast in clear language rather than delay. On August 25th, German radio operators intercept two messages that effectively hand them the battle. The first comes from Rennenkampf. It details his First Army's marching plans for the next several days and crucially reveals he will not be moving to support Samsonov. Instead, he's continuing his advance toward Königsberg, following his own operational objectives. The second intercept comes from Samsonov himself. Having pushed back the German Techjets Corps in a small engagement at Orlau-Frankenau the previous day, he interprets the German withdrawal as a general retreat. His unencrypted message lays out his entire plan of pursuit, including specific routes and timings. When Hoffmann receives these intercepts, he immediately brings them to Ludendorff and Hindenburg. The two senior commanders are skeptical. Surely this must be a ruse. What commander would be foolish enough to broadcast battle plans in the open, let alone two of them? But the intercepts are authentic. The fog of war has lifted, revealing the entire Russian disposition and intentions. Hoffmann's plan is approved. What follows is one of the most remarkable logistical operations of the early war. The German Duis Corps, commanded by General Hermann von François, receives orders to disengage from Rennenkampf's front and transfer by rail to the opposite flank, a distance of over 200 miles. Prussian railroad efficiency turns what should take days into a matter of hours. Entire divisions, with their artillery and supplies, are loaded onto trains and whisked across East Prussia through the night. By August 26th, François' corps is in position on Samsonov's left flank, near the town of Ustau. Meanwhile, General August von Mackensen's 17th Corps strikes Samsonov's right flank. The pincers are beginning to close. Samsonov enters the battle under multiple disadvantages, and most of them he doesn't even know about. First, there's the fundamental problem of command. He's been appointed to lead the Second Army despite having no recent experience commanding forces larger than a cavalry division. His years in Turkestan, while prestigious administratively, have left him unprepared for the complexities of coordinating a 200,000-man army across dozens of miles of difficult terrain. Second, there's a crucial disagreement with his superior, General Zielinski, about the army's direction of advance. Samsonov wants to move northwest toward the towns of Allenstein and Osterode. Zielinski prefers a more northerly route toward Zeeburg and Allenstein. They compromise, but the result satisfies neither man and leaves Samsonov's forces partially dispersed. The 6th Corps is detached to move toward Bischofsburg, separating it from the main body of the army. This corps will later escape the encirclement, but at the cost of not being available when most needed. Third, logistics are a nightmare. The Second Army is advancing faster than its supply lines can keep up. Russian and German railways use different track gauges, making it impossible to simply use captured German rail infrastructure. Food, ammunition and fodder for the thousands of horses must be transported by wagon over increasingly poor roads. Men are already going hungry. Fourth, his soldiers, while numerous, are not as well trained or well equipped as their German opponents. They carry inferior rifles, their artillery is outdated, and ammunition is already running short. Many have received only basic training before being thrown into combat. Finally, and perhaps most critically, Samsonov is physically unwell. Overweight and suffering from chronic asthma, he struggles with the physical demands of field command. In an era when generals often need to ride from unit to unit to maintain personal oversight, Samsonov's condition is a serious handicap. But none of these problems compare to the strategic blindness he's operating under. He has no idea that the Germans have intercepted his plans. He doesn't know that Francois's entire corps has been moved to his flank by rail. And he cannot know that Rennenkampf, with whom he has no direct communication and whom he deeply distrusts, has no intention of moving quickly to support him. On August 26th, the battle begins in earnest. Francois's corps, though ordered to attack immediately, delays until his artillery is fully positioned, a decision that enrages Ludendorff but proves tactically sound. When the assault comes on August 27th, it smashes into Samsonov's left flank with devastating force. Simultaneously, Mackensen's 17th Corps pounds Samsonov's right flank from the north. The Russian center, comprising the 13th, 15th and 23rd Corps, initially pushes forward, believing they're pursuing a retreating enemy. Some units achieve local successes, driving German forces back. These small victories create a dangerous illusion that the Russians are winning, but the center is advancing into a trap. With both flanks under heavy attack and beginning to crumble, the Russian center is pushing deeper into a closing vice. By August 28th, the true horror of the situation begins to dawn on Samsonov. His I Corps on the left is retreating in disorder. His Sixth Corps on the right is falling back, bloodied and barely cohesive. His center has pushed so far forward that it now risks complete encirclement. He sends urgent messages to Rennenkampf begging for support. The First Army must turn southwest immediately and relieve the pressure. But Rennenkampf is 100 miles away, still marching on Königsberg, his cavalry screening force deliberately misled by German units into thinking the main German army is still to his front. Whether Rennenkampf could have helped even if he wanted to becomes a moot question. By the time he receives Samsonov's appeals, it's already too late. By the evening of August 28th, Francois's corps has swung east and formed a line running from Niedenburg to Willenburg, directly across the Second Army's line of retreat. The 16th Corps has moved southwest to meet them. Dawn breaks on August 29, 1914, over the forests and marshlands of East Prussia. For the men of the Russian Second Army's center, the 13th, 15th and 13th Corps, the day begins with a terrible realization. They are surrounded. During the night, Russian forces attempting to retreat south toward the border encountered German positions everywhere they turned. Francois's Corps blocks the southern routes. The 17th Corps holds the northern approaches. To the west, where they advanced so confidently just days before, German forces have regrouped and now press forward. The trap that Colonel Hoffmann designed, that Hindenburg and Ludendorff approved, is now sprung shut. Approximately 150,000 Russian soldiers entered the battle. Within the encirclement pocket near the town of Frogenau, perhaps 60,000 to 70,000 men now face annihilation. The fighting on August 29th is desperate and chaotic. What military historians call a meeting engagement, repeated thousands of times across the pocket, as scattered Russian units attempt to break through German lines they encounter by accident in the dense terrain. The landscape works against the Russians. The area around Tannenberg is a mixture of thick forests, lakes, marshes, and sandy soil. Roads are few and poor. Units become separated in the woods. Officers lose contact with their commands. Entire battalions wander lost through the trees, seeking either their own forces or a route of escape. German artillery, positioned on the higher ground surrounding the pocket, pounds the trapped Russian forces mercilessly. The thunder of shells becomes constant, inescapable. Trees shatter, earth erupts, men die by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Some Russian units maintain cohesion and fight with desperate courage. They form defensive positions and attempt to create corridors for retreat. Small groups achieve temporary breakthroughs, only to find themselves facing fresh German positions beyond. The bravery of individual soldiers and junior officers is extraordinary, but bravery cannot overcome fundamental strategic defeat. Other units simply dissolve. Soldiers abandon their weapons and attempt to slip through German lines individually or in small groups. Some succeed, navigating through the forests by night, making their way back toward the Russian border. Most are captured. The Russian artillery, which entered the battle with numerical superiority but inferior guns, runs critically low on ammunition. Gun crews fire their last shells, then destroy their pieces rather than let them be captured. But many guns are simply abandoned as their crews retreat or are overrun before they can withdraw. Throughout this catastrophe, General Samsonov attempts what no commander in 1914 has the ability to do: personally control a disintegrating army across dozens of miles of forested terrain. Lacking reliable communications, Samsonov resorts to the methods of earlier centuries. He rides from corps headquarters to corps headquarters, attempting to assess the situation and issue orders directly. It's an impossible task. The distances are too great, the situation too fluid, and his physical condition too poor. Witnesses describe a general in the grip of growing desperation. The energetic cavalry officer of earlier years has been replaced by an exhausted, asthmatic man in his mid-50s, struggling to stay in his saddle. The reality of what is happening to his army, to the men entrusted to his command, is becoming undeniable. On the night of August 28th, realizing the full extent of the encirclement, Samsonov makes his decision. He orders a general retreat to the southeast, back toward the Russian border in safety. But the order comes too late and cannot reach many units. Those who do receive it find the roads clogged with abandoned wagons, ambulances, and streams of walking wounded. What should be an orderly withdrawal becomes a rout. Throughout August 29th, Samsonov continues his desperate attempts to reach his corps commanders. He's accompanied by his staff officers and a small Cossack escort riding through a landscape of defeat. They encounter columns of retreating soldiers, wounded men pleading for help, and abandoned equipment. Several times they approach crossroads or villages, only to discover German forces have already taken them. Each time they must detour, pushing deeper into the shrinking pocket of Russian-controlled territory. As evening approaches, attempting to find the remnants of Sissek's corps, Samsonov and his party discover that the last road out, the final escape route, is now in German hands. The general dismounts. His physical condition, never good, has deteriorated severely. Exhausted from days of riding, asthmatic and overweight, he can barely walk. His staff, younger and fitter, must slow their pace constantly to accommodate him. Samsonov orders his Cossack escort to save themselves, to attempt to break through on horseback while they still can. Then he and his staff officers set out on foot through the forests, attempting to navigate south toward Russian lines in the darkness. Witnesses later report that Samsonov was mumbling to himself, the same phrase repeated like a prayer. "The Emperor trusted me. How can I face him? The Emperor trusted me." It's near midnight. They're deep in the forest, moving slowly through trees that all look the same in the darkness. Samsonov, struggling with each step, begins to fall behind the others. His chief of staff, looking back, realizes the general is no longer with them. Before anyone can react, a single gunshot cracks through the night forest. On August 30th, the last organized Russian resistance inside the pocket collapses. Units that have held out surrender en masse. The scale of the disaster becomes clear. The official German report, submitted by Hindenburg to Kaiser Wilhelm II on August 31st, claims the destruction of 3 entire Russian corps, the 13th, 15th and 23rd. The numbers are staggering. Approximately 92,000 Russian soldiers captured, another 30,000 killed or wounded in the fighting. Between 350 and 500 artillery pieces captured, thousands of wagons, tens of thousands of rifles, and mountains of supplies and equipment. Of the original 150,000 men in Samsonov's Second Army, only about 10,000 managed to escape the encirclement, mostly from the wings that were not fully trapped, and individuals who slipped through the German lines in the chaos. 3.5 Russian army corps have effectively ceased to exist. The German casualties, by comparison, are remarkably light. Sources vary, but most estimate between 12,000 and 20,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing out of the 150,000 committed to the battle, a casualty rate of roughly 8 to 13%. It takes 60 trains to transport all the captured Russian equipment back to Germany. On August 30th or 31st, sources differ on the exact date, German search parties sweeping the forests for Russian stragglers discover a body. It's General Samsonov. He died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head using his service revolver. His body is found where he collapsed in the forest, his staff officers having discovered him after hearing the shot, but too late to intervene. The Germans, recognizing who he is, accord him a military burial with honors befitting his rank. Through the International Red Cross, his body is eventually returned to his widow, one of the few dignities preserved in the midst of catastrophe. Samsonov never learned the full extent of the disaster that befell his army, but he knew enough. The weight of 100,000 casualties, men killed, wounded, or captured under his command, was more than he could bear. The thought of reporting such a defeat to Tsar Nicholas II, who had personally appointed him to command, was unbearable. In the rigid honor culture of the Imperial Russian Officer Corps, such a catastrophic failure demanded accountability. For Samsonov, there was only one way to accept responsibility for what had happened. While Samsonov lies dead in the forests of East Prussia, the full strategic implications of the Battle of Tannenberg are only beginning to unfold. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, virtually unknown before the battle, are instantly transformed into national heroes in Germany. The victory is so complete, so spectacular, that it obscures the overall strategic situation, where Germany's invasion of France is simultaneously stalling. The battle is named Tannenberg at Hindenburg's personal request, though the actual fighting took place miles from that village. The name is chosen for symbolic reasons. In 1410, at Tannenberg, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth defeated the Teutonic Knights in one of medieval Europe's decisive battles. 500 years later, Germany has its revenge, or so the propaganda claims. For Russia, Tannenberg is a catastrophe that reverberates far beyond the immediate military losses. The defeat shatters the aura of the Russian steamroller, the belief that Russia's massive armies would inevitably overwhelm Germany through sheer numbers. It exposes the dysfunction of Russian command, the inadequacy of Russian communications and logistics, and the price of personal feuds among senior officers. And Rennenkampf, he continues to command the First Army for several more months, but his failure to support Samsonov, whether due to old grudges, poor communication, or legitimate operational concerns, marks him. Accusations of incompetence and even treason begin to circulate. He's eventually relieved of command in late 1914, but the destruction of the Second Army isn't the end of Russia's agony in East Prussia. For the Russian First Army, under General Rennenkampf, the weeks following Tannenberg become a mirror of the Second Army's destruction. Fresh from their overwhelming victory, Hindenburg and Ludendorff turn their attention north. The German Eighth Army, reinforced and confident, marches to confront Rennenkampf's forces, which are still operating in northeastern East Prussia. From September 7th to 14th, 1914, the Germans execute a similar encirclement strategy at what becomes known as the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes. While not as complete a victory as Tannenberg, Rennenkampf manages to extract much of his army. The result is still devastating. The Russians lose approximately 125,000 men, mostly as prisoners, and are forced into a chaotic retreat, back across the border. By mid-September 1914, the Russian invasion of East Prussia has completely collapsed. Both the First and Second Armies have been shattered. The combined losses approach 250,000 men, killed, wounded or captured, in less than a month of fighting. The Russian steamroller that was supposed to crush Germany while France held in the west has instead been stopped cold at the German border. For General Paul von Rennenkampf, Tannenberg casts a shadow from which he never emerges. The questions begin immediately. Why didn't he march to support Samsonov? Was it the old grudge from Mukden? Was it poor communication from front headquarters? Was it legitimate operational concerns about his own position? Modern historians remain divided. Some evidence suggests Rennenkampf genuinely didn't understand the severity of Samsonov's situation until too late. The fog of war was thick in 1914, and communication between the armies was poor. German cavalry screening forces successfully deceived him about enemy positions. By the time he realized the disaster unfolding to his south, the encirclement was already complete. But others point to the timing. Rennenkampf received some of Samsonov's appeals for help, while there might still have been time to react. His response was slow and hesitant. Whether this was due to personal animosity, excessive caution, or simple military incompetence becomes almost impossible to determine, but the consequences were identical. In November 1914, Rennenkampf commands his army at the Battle of Łódź in Poland. The battle is inconclusive, but accusations of incompetence continue to mount. There are even whispers of treason, particularly damaging given his German heritage. In late 1914, he's relieved of command. The remainder of his life is tragic. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Rennenkampf initially attempts to stay neutral, but in 1918, he's arrested by the Bolsheviks. On April 1, 1918, less than 4 years after Tannenberg, he's executed by firing squad in Taganrog. The Battle of Tannenberg, while not strategically decisive for the overall course of World War I, has profound implications. First, it allows Germany to stabilize the Eastern Front. The immediate threat to German territory is eliminated. While Russia remains a formidable opponent with vast manpower reserves, the aura of inevitability around Russian numerical superiority has been shattered. Second, the battle arguably impacts the Western Front at a crucial moment. The German High Command, concerned about the Russian invasion of East Prussia, had transferred 2 corps from the west to reinforce the east. These forces arrived too late to participate in Tannenberg, but crucially, they were also absent during the Battle of the Marne in early September 1914, where French and British forces stopped the German advance on Paris. Some historians argue that those 2 corps might have made the difference between German victory and the stalemate that developed. Third, for Russia, Tannenberg is a psychological blow from which the army never fully recovers. The defeat exposes the dysfunctions that will eventually contribute to Russia's collapse: poor logistics, inadequate communications, rivalry among commanders, outdated equipment, and a rigid command culture that stifles initiative. The disaster also weakens the prestige of the Tsarist regime itself. Questions begin to circulate. How could Russia, with its millions of soldiers, suffer such a catastrophic defeat? What happened to the men of the Second Army? The government initially tries to suppress news of the scale of the disaster. It's that bad, but rumors spread. In Germany, Tannenberg becomes something more than a military victory. It becomes a founding myth of resilience and German military genius. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are lionized. The aged Hindenburg, brought out of retirement, becomes the embodiment of Prussian military tradition, saving the fatherland from Slavic hordes. Ludendorff is the modern military genius, the staff officer whose brilliance designed victory. The actual architect of the victory, Colonel Max Hoffmann, receives far less public credit, a slight that apparently irritates him. Years later, Hoffmann gives tours of the battlefield, pointing out, with evident sarcasm, "This is where the field marshal slept before the battle, this is where he slept after the battle, and this is where he slept during the battle." But public mythology rarely concerns itself with such details. Hindenburg's star continues to rise. By 1916, he replaces Erich von Falkenhayn as chief of the German General Staff, effectively becoming Germany's military dictator for the remainder of the war, with Ludendorff as his quartermaster general. In the 1920s, as Germany struggles with defeat, the Treaty of Versailles, and economic chaos, Tannenberg's symbolic importance grows even larger. For a nation humiliated by the war's outcome, Tannenberg represents the moment when Germany stood victorious, when Prussian military tradition triumphed, when the superior German soldier overcame numerical odds. The fact that the battle took place on German soil, that it was technically defensive, allows it to be reframed as evidence that World War I was forced upon Germany, that the Russian colossus invaded peaceful German territory. In 1927, the German government completes the Tannenberg Memorial near Hohenstein, now Olsztynek in Poland, a massive structure designed to commemorate both the 1914 battle and the medieval victory over the Teutonic Knights. The architecture is deliberately imposing, almost mystical. 8 massive towers arranged in a circle, evoking both military power and pagan ritual. Field Marshal von Hindenburg, now retired but still a towering figure in German politics, is involved in the memorial's dedication. When he dies in 1934, his body is interred there, against his family's wishes, in a ceremony attended by the new German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. The Nazis enthusiastically embrace Tannenberg's symbolism. Hitler renames it the Reichsehrenmal, the Reich Memorial, and uses it for massive propaganda rallies. The victory is reframed as proof of German racial superiority, of the eternal struggle between Germanic civilization and Slavic barbarism. But in 1945, as the Soviet Red Army advances into East Prussia, the Germans hastily evacuate Hindenburg's remains. The monument itself is blown up by retreating German forces to prevent it from becoming a Soviet trophy. Today, only fragments remain. This question haunts military historians. The answer is complicated, but several factors stand out. The personal feud between Samsonov and Rennenkampf certainly didn't help, but it may not have been decisive. The fundamental problems were structural. Russia, mobilized faster than its logistics could support, launched an invasion with inadequate communications infrastructure, and placed 2 separate armies under a distant command that couldn't effectively coordinate them. The decision to broadcast orders in plain text was catastrophic, but it stemmed from systemic failures in Russian military preparation, insufficient codebooks, poor training, and the belief that rapid action mattered more than security. Samsonov himself was arguably not suited for the command he received. A capable cavalry officer and administrator, he lacked experience commanding forces at this scale, was physically unwell, and found himself in a position where success required abilities he simply didn't possess. The Germans, meanwhile, benefited from superior railroads, interior lines of communication, better trained staff officers, and commanders willing to take calculated risks. Hoffmann's insight about the Russian generals' mutual hatred was brilliant. But even without it, the structural advantages favored Germany. Perhaps most importantly, the entire Russian offensive was premature. Launched early to relieve pressure on France, the invasion sent incompletely mobilized armies into difficult terrain with inadequate preparation. The strategic imperative, helping France, overrode operational readiness. Behind the statistics and strategy lie individual tragedies multiplied by tens of thousands. Russian soldiers, many of them peasant conscripts who barely understood why they were fighting, died in forests far from home. They starved, they were shelled, they were captured and sent to prisoner of war camps where conditions were harsh. Those who made it back to Russia often found a country sliding toward revolution and civil war. German soldiers, despite their victory, still died by the thousands. The Eastern Front would grind on for 3 more years, consuming millions more lives on both sides. And there was Samsonov himself, a man who, whatever his flaws as a commander, genuinely cared about his soldiers and felt the weight of command. His suicide was an act of despair, but also of accountability. In the honor culture he inhabited, he took responsibility in the only way he believed he could. His widow never remarried. His reputation, initially tarnished by the defeat, has been partially rehabilitated by historians who recognize the impossible situation he faced. Today, the Battle of Tannenberg is studied in military academies worldwide as an example of encirclement tactics, the importance of communication security, and the dangers of divided command. The battlefield itself, now in Poland, has been largely reclaimed by agriculture and forest. Small monuments mark where the fighting occurred. The villages where Russians and Germans died have different names now, Germanized after 1914, then Polonized after 1945. For Russia, Tannenberg remains a painful memory, one of several catastrophic defeats that foreshadowed the empire's collapse. The battle is sometimes cited as evidence of the Tsarist military's dysfunction, though some modern Russian historians argue that Samsonov has been unfairly scapegoated for systemic failures beyond his control. For Germany, Tannenberg's symbolic power was eventually poisoned by its association with Nazi propaganda. The memorial's destruction in 1945 was perhaps fitting. The mythology built around the battle had been weaponized for purposes that had nothing to do with the 1914 reality. The tragedy of Tannenberg is that it was, in many ways, avoidable. Better communications, better logistics, better coordination between commanders, or even just waiting a few more weeks for mobilization to complete, any of these might have changed the outcome. But World War I was full of such tragedies. The conflict that contemporaries called the Great War, and that we now know as World War I, was characterized by generals learning the brutal realities of industrial warfare through catastrophic mistakes. Samsonov's decision to take his own life in the forests of East Prussia stands as a stark reminder of the human dimension behind military statistics. Behind the numbers, 92,000 captured, 30,000 killed or wounded, were individuals, soldiers who suffered and died, families who lost fathers and sons, and one general who could not live with what had happened to the men under his command. In the end, the Battle of Tannenberg destroyed not just 3 Russian corps, but also the careers of multiple generals, the lives of over 100,000 men, and a piece of the Russian Empire's credibility. The battle's shadow stretched across the remainder of World War I and into the dark years that followed. Today, visitors to the site can walk through quiet forests and peaceful farmland. There's little to suggest that this place once witnessed one of World War I's greatest disasters. The guns are silent, the screams have faded, the armies have long since marched away or into the grave. But the questions remain. What if Samsonov and Rennenkampf had reconciled their feud? What if the Russians had waited to invade until fully prepared? What if someone had insisted on encrypted communications? History doesn't answer what-if questions. It only records what happened, and what happened here, in August 1914, was a catastrophe that changed the course of the Great War and the fate of empires.